On today's show, we're cutting through the hype and examining the real-world applications of AI. Join us as we talk to experts, explore case studies, and ask the tough questions about the potential risks and downsides of this powerful technology. Get ready for an illuminating discussion about the pros and cons of AI adoption. And yes, I did ask ChatGPT to write that introduction as if we were the Daily Show. But we do have a great panel today. So first, I'd like to welcome Professor Michael Barrett, who he does so much at CJBS, but I like to think of him as teaching everything digital. Welcome, Michael.
Nice to be on the show. Thank you, Conrad.
Then we have Kellyann Ripnar. She's an EMBA alum, and she worked on a startup idea here at CJBS's Accelerator and is now COO and co-founder of Fincrime Dynamics. So welcome, Kellyann.
Thank you for the invite, Conrad.
And lastly, we have Curlene Larsson, who is an MBA alum and AI evangelist. She's worked with many businesses to adopt AI solutions in an ethical manner. So welcome, Curlene.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Kellyann, if you could start maybe with talking a bit about the company that you are CEO and co-founder, Fincrime Dynamics, and basically how does it use AI and what's the problem that it tries to solve?
Of course. So simply we use AI to fight financial crime. And financial crime affects us all, from not just the big newspaper money laundering issues, but also just the average day crimes that affect your friends, even your granny, and often it's not even your own fault. So you can see here some figures on the actual problem of financial crime. They are quite large and they are increasing. So even by 24% last year in the UK alone. And we as an organization, we in fact globally $213 billion is spent on financial crime compliance per year, which is a fair amount. So what we do in Fincrime Dynamics is use AI to try and fight this by creating synthetic data and running simulations around financial crime.
All right. Thanks so much, Kellyann. And I wanted to ask, how does AI help in ways where, previously, I'm sure, financial crime has been around since the dawn of money. So people have obviously been trying to combat that. What is that difference that AI makes for financial institutions when it comes to this problem?
So we have a phrase that we're the financial crime vaccine. So as an example, you would model a virus. And if I go on to slide number 2, you can see that as you'd model a virus, we model crime. And then we use accounts and transactions. And you can see this in the first part. Then that starts to build immunity, similar to your body. You then inject the vaccine into your body and the body starts to fight and build up immunity. And that's what we do in regards to financial institutions, payments, cryptocurrency exchanges. And then eventually the third part here is protection. Unfortunately, we can't say fully protected because that's not possible. Viruses are always changing, as is financial crime. But what does happen is we start to slowly build protection, and we do that using and generating synthetic data, which is very much the fuel for machine learning. And we simulate crime and financially benchmark performance.
So can you tell us a bit more about what is this synthetic data? Is it sort of, based on past instances of financial fraud and we just develop some rules, stress test the system, or is there more to it?
So synthetic data is a very interesting topic, and as a whole, it's known more frequently today, but it has been around for some time. And so it's really great that we're talking about AI and synthetic data in our normal day-to-day language. In short, it's reliable data in that it's an analytical twin. It's also scalable, which is great when you have large sums of data. And finally, it's also client sensitive. So particularly relevant in the medical world and also in the financial crime world, where data and specifics are kept hidden, let's say.
Cool. And I think this is a good time to open it up to Michael and Curlene as well, which is one of the things about AI like companies that use AI to sell services like Fincrime, it becomes such a competitive advantage. Your model becomes such a competitive advantage. The data that you use to train the model, right? But everything becomes like a black box. So how should clients or businesses who are approached by startups like Fincrime, how should they assess which one works and what is the quality of the data that they use?
Curlene, you want to start?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. I was looking at you nodding.
Yeah.
So that's a tough one. So for companies that are procuring AI solutions from startups, there are a couple of ways they can go about it. Obviously, they want to have trust in the system that they're buying. For this solution specifically, it's my understanding that the company would come with their own small data set, and then synthetic data would be built out of it to extrapolate up the number of rows and parameters of data that they have, right? So I think if that's the basis, the initial data set needs to be unbiased, right? It needs to be assessed to make sure that once it goes through this engine and you've gone from a small data set to a larger data set, it's checked for things like the initial data set is checked for things like trust. It's checked for things like fairness. It's checked for things like bias, right? So you don't want to take a poorly data set and make more data out of it. So that's the first instance. I would say also organizations need to ask these smaller companies, what is the ethical process that goes into your product design? Oftentimes people think of regulation and governance after the fact when the model is in the wild. But as you're building and solving that problem, who's at the table? Do they come from varied backgrounds? And most importantly, when I speak to the developers and machine learning specialists, a lot of them experience decision fatigue, right? So they're not ethicists themselves, and they're not the expert on if they should be solving it. Is this right? How is this going to affect customers and humanities 5-10 years down the line? So has an ethicist been a part of that product development lifecycle, right? And asking startups, like, what is your design process? Who's in the room? Where do developers and machine learning specialists have an avenue to vet some of their concerns, if any, and correct course before the model is released into the wild? Because yes, the EU has been working on regulation for 4 or 5 years now. I know the US, they've come up with regulation in the last 2 to 3 years, but that's after the fact. If you start earlier, there's less damage and less to fix, less brand reputation to correct once it goes wild. That's my input.
Yeah, fantastic. Maybe just to build on that, the whole idea of selecting and who does the selecting for large companies, let's say, of startups. Increasingly in the research that I'm doing with colleagues, we see how important the building, bringing together of who are appropriate companies like Simone, like the ones that Fincrime has suggested, and the extent to which ethical design and how the algorithms are developed is a big part of how they evaluate which of the applications to bring forward to the companies. So the matching of the problem and the ethical design and the development really hugely important. And that leads to the avenue of trust, which Curlene also mentioned about, because what we see in a lot of organizations, large companies, is that whether it's an external company, meaning an AI company, or having their in-house data scientists and teams of analytics developers, to what extent they are actually working closely with the business owners to understand the problem and to understand the information governance that needs to go into the product. Hugely important as to whether or not trust is built up around the applications that are built. And then one of the outcomes that we're seeing in the research is that there's a lot of what we call trust transference, where if the data is either seen to be poor or not appropriate, or the algorithm is not built well because of lack of good unbiased training data, then the person who represents that model, meaning the analytics and the data scientists, are not trusted either. And this leads to huge delays and slowdowns in adoption of what could be helpful and valuable applications. Maybe one other last point to briefly mention is the regulators. Again, hugely important, especially those that are looking at successful companies that are starting to grow very large in certain narrow domain areas, the extent to which they have too much of an advantage in the market, and whether there's anti-market play for consumers. So that's another really important factor to look into.
I think where you've mentioned trust, I'm just going to add that transparency
go ahead.
Goes hand in hand with trust. And I think with AI and models, transparency is particularly important, even to the extent of how do you control the training process, for example, and particularly the inputs, so the training data and the metrics, which are the outputs, and perhaps even in some cases having a less complex but more transparent algorithm might be a trade-off to facilitate both the trust that you mentioned there and therefore the transparency.
Great point.
Yeah. And explainability, not to beat this topic, right? But, if you can explain how you got to the answer that you got to, that also goes a long way in terms of peeking into the black box.
Definitely. And not to talk about synthetic data too much, but it actually offers a unique advantage because in terms of training and testing the AI models, using high quality synthetic data actually improves both accuracy and effectiveness of models. So it enables you to better serve clients and therefore mitigate risks as well. But I love the way you put it, Simone, about into the wild before you just release it. It's a nice expression.
Yeah. So before I ask Kellyann, actually, what are the questions that her potential clients have posed? Whether trust, ethics, transparency are those main questions. Just wanted to highlight or to give a shout out to some of the viewers today. So we have Shamin, who says they've already started AI in their business with tremendous results. So great there. Manuel is a fan of Michael Barrett's Digital Innovation and Transformation Program. So thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to see you,
Marcial's watching this from Bolivia. Krista's from Bermuda. Vivek asks, will a recording be shared afterwards? Yes, you just have to go back to the same link on YouTube or LinkedIn and you can watch the recording. And yeah, so if we go back to Kellyann, what are some of the big questions main questions that potential clients of yours ask about your AI model?
I'd say it's maybe asking what's the comparison between what had been done previously. And say, for example, at the moment, when one looks at rule-based approach, AI and machine learning is very further along the chart in regards to both detection and efficiency. And so that really helps in regards to trying to detect financial crime. And that would be the differentiator between before and now using AI and machine learning.
Yeah. And I love this slide that you gave me, Kellyann, which is, let me just hide this, which is, if you can talk us through a bit about what this slide is trying to convey in terms of going from that lower left to the upper right.
Of course. So lower left, we have rule-based. So this is a wide net. Now, if you imagine, in this case, your rule-based system is as good as the person that created it. And with all respect, if you imagine someone that's not necessarily that creative or imaginative, then the rules based around that are similar. But of course, the world's constantly changing. So how often do you check this? How often do you update it and train them? So as we move up this diagram to scenario-based, which is slightly more effective and also cost-efficient in regards to detection, those alerts come from the tree scenario to evaluate risk. Moving further, we have risk weighted. So that's where you actually expose the exposure of alerts more apparent. And finally, the most cost efficient and effective detection is machine learning. And that's ultimately where you're able to lower false positive alerts for behavioral detection. And that's where we work. That's where the AI part comes in.
Yeah, many years ago when I was doing my undergrad, I did computer programming, and basically I now see that I'm stuck in that lower left where I'm just trying to figure out, through programming where you hardwire everything, and I can't get my head around machine learning. So yeah, but we've got a couple of questions here as well. So I think this next question for Curlene, which is from Saswati, she asked, how would you recommend going about ethics in AI when you implement AI models in a business?
So if you've gotten to the implementation stage, I don't want to say it's a bit too late, but if you're getting to implementation and ethics hasn't been a part of your product lifecycle, perhaps it's to make sure that you have the governance tools to monitor your deployment, make sure there's no model drift, make sure new data that's being fed into the model as it's operationalized isn't skewing the results, right? If you're talking about early on in the cycle, there are many ethicists available on LinkedIn who advertise their services. But what I would say, what's key in bringing ethicists into the fray is making sure that they are well-versed in your industry and the specialism of AI that you're focusing on and the types of data that you're focusing on. And then also an ethicist that specializes in legal, in the regulatory aspect of it as well. And they could be, I'm not saying a team of 5 to 7 people, it can be at least 3 people, but these are the considerations you need to bring in. So the technique that's used for prediction and deep neural networks and large language models are different, right? So there might be ethicists that specialize in different areas of AI and machine learning. But also making sure that they get your industry and the problem that you're trying to solve.
Perhaps I might add that doing audits on AI models can also be really helpful for the intent identifying. So businesses can establish clear criteria for assessing the performance of the AI system, as well as accuracy and fairness.
I can just say a little bit from what everybody's using now, ChatGPT, that the whole sense of, it's in some ways amazing, the human-like replies that we're getting. Not there yet, of course, in total, especially if you talk to some of my sort of computing colleagues, we would still call it a stochastic parrot or puppet because of what it's drawing on, but it's still an amazing step forward. And what's really wrestling with me ethically is the idea of how it can be used to create very believable but inaccurate and therefore misleading pieces of content, which really can lead to misinformation in a way that we haven't seen before. And it's a very interesting ethical and social dimension that will play out. And indeed, no doubt regulators will be involved to help with that. But it's a fascinating stage that we're at in thinking of the ethics and the social impact.
Yeah, and this is a good time to bring in Jeremy's comment, which is, we've talked trust and transparency, but ChatGPT is the fastest growing adopted platform, right? 100 million users in 2 months. And it's the worst one in terms of non-transparency. So is transparency such a major business factor or decision when, again, if you look at how Microsoft is trying to keep everything black box so that Google doesn't steal a march on it? Is this really how important is transparency versus retaining that competitive advantage?
In my experience, it all comes down to ROI and impact on the business, the bottom line, and the brand. So I think these large AI first, tech first company will hold on to their models and not necessarily play to the transparency angle until a catastrophe happens, right? And they go into recovery mode. I think for smaller companies, for startups, so I've come across founders who were ex-Google, ex-Facebook, ex-Microsoft, VP of engineering, VP of AI ML, and their primary concern are the ethical considerations, because they can't take the hit that a Microsoft and a Google can take in terms of the fines or the shaming of the brand, right? I think that it is important to recognize that we as consumers, we have short memories, right? So if we give more of the AI and tech first large behemoths considerations that we might not give smaller companies. But I think it's a play between ROI, brand damage, and who can really get away with what. So they might not take it into consideration, but that doesn't mean it's not going to come and bite them in the head a couple months from now.
Yeah, I have to mention how Microsoft put as a disclaimer to ChatGPT that it can sometimes give you usefully wrong answers, right?
You can do that.
And
Absolutely.
I don't know whether it was the legal or the marketing guys who came up with that phrase, but I think it'll go down the same level as fake news.
And it's a really important point, though, Conrad, because if you look at, remembering what, for example, ChatGPT is drawing on and how transparent we understand the quality of the data that it's drawing on, the companies may have their own large language models and that they can, if you like, circumscribe the data sets. But we know a lot of the data is some of it's really good data, but a lot of it is internet based, which again, the quality of the data needs to be really looked at in detail. So for example, we might all trust a Wikipedia sort of source, even though it's publicly available, because of the reviewing cycle of the large hordes of volunteers that are really trying to manage and curate effectively, useful information. So there's both the quality, but also the timeliness, until we can see rapid updates, depending on the importance of, update frequency of the data for your models and for your business. Well, ChatGPT is going to be months behind. So it's really important to consider that, as well as data completeness, the extent to which is it able to capture, for example, if you're an engineer, is there adequate engineering data for doing a lot of your work? So, whether it's the quality of the data, the timeliness of the data, or the completeness of it, these are the things to understand and to be transparent about as to how that's going to affect the value of you using sources like ChatGPT and large language models.
Yeah. And Kellyann, I think this is a question for you. So Raj asks, when dealing with a dynamic, ever-changing problem like financial crime, how well can new models be developed to counteract new potential patterns that previous models may not have been solving for?
So I'm just going to read it quickly. So as a whole, how well can new models be developed to counteract new potential patterns? And so in regards to our business, we have a group of amazing advisors who are real people, and they're experts in the field. And I think there's a case of ensuring that we're up to date with our models, but also taking input from our professional experts who have been working in the area a long time as well. So a combination of both AI expertise, training the models, keeping up to date with both education as well as regulations, etc., mixed in with personal expertise is something that we try to do.
So it's not a case of just letting the model run wild, but you need that
exactly.
human.
There's that term that's come back in again.
Yeah, you need that human supervision, or training, or continuing to train, provide new data to train it and keep it up to date. Is that right?
Yes, and I'd say as a whole, in regards to a few of these questions, ongoing education and training helps businesses stay informed, both within AI and best practices for ensuring ethical and unbiased AI. It also includes actual employees on the ethical implications of AI and how to identify potential biases. And businesses should also stay informed about emerging regulations and standards related to AI and ensure their systems are in compliance as well. And so perhaps another item I would mention is actually collaborating with other providers, industry professionals at large, and trying to share some of the information across the ecosystem, of course, in a safe way. And so here we can talk about a collaborative landscape as opposed to just being a competitive one. This is one example where we talk about where we sit as Fincrime Dynamics, but ultimately there's always direct and indirect relationships, but ultimately it's about trying to look at reducing the overall impact that financial crime has to the everyday person. And so the more we can share information in a safe way, then that also helps all parties, let's say.
Okay. And we've got another question here from Nishant. And I'm going to reframe this. So Nishant asks, how much time and cost does AI integration take to be put into an application? So I guess it's a business process. So I'll reframe it and start with Michael. Obviously, ChatGPT was adopted incredibly quickly, right? That kind of diffusion was incredibly quickly. What do you think, though, with business adoption of AI? How quickly will that, how fast will that take? Is this a case that every business sees that they need to do some kind of AI adoption, and therefore the competitive market pressures mean that AI just goes adopted really widely across businesses? Or is this going to be a much more slow, drawn-out process?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and it could be a long answer. I'll try to keep it short. In that especially with your last point there, what we've seen, and whether it's in healthcare or in different areas of financial services, is that AI in its current incarnation, third wave, it's been around 7-10 years, and a lot of potential, a lot of amazing opportunities to show task performance in incredible ways, and a number of projects across the world, that talking to common researchers in different sectors, are dismayed at how slow the process seems to be when you look at how it's actually been taken up. And part of that, I would say, is that we really finally fully understood that we've got to go beyond the idea of tasks and jobs, occupations, which is important, but to see and understand workflow and how these AI tools are really redesigning and integrating with the workflow. So it's a really good question that's been posed. And I think that's sort of taken some time to really appreciate and understand. And so I think that, as you say, with ChatGPT, where there's enormous potential, right? There's we're very much at that peaked, in sort of hype inflation of what it can do. Some recent work that I've been doing with colleagues in the professional services sector really highlights that, indeed, that there are different kinds of tasks that will be more subject to changes in the workflow of different occupations. You think, for example, classification tasks, so things like patent searches, legal document searches, maintaining archives, these kinds of things. You're going to see a lot of take up into the workflow. And what we've all learned ourselves from using ChatGPT is that it's not just about plugging something in. The whole use of the dialogue and formatting and how you frame input, how you use the answers to follow up with questions and work with the tool. Really, the more expert you are at that, the better it'll be useful for your workflow and improving it. So there are those classification tasks that we see a lot of potential automation for, but which would be quite different from, say, creative tasks, where we are still seeing an incursion with ChatGPT, with things like marketing materials, presentations, and even sort of technical creative tasks, whether that's around, for us as academics, drafting, lit reviews, things that get you started in the workflow, that make you think about more widely course outlines, that you're covering things that are relevant, up to date, and very important. So lots of automation, not of the whole task, but of parts of the task of a job that is expected to, be significant. Some estimates are that about maybe 40% of jobs in some way will be seeing an impact over the next 10 years. in terms of overall tasks, around 3%. That might not sound like a lot, but then when you translate that in the UK, it's about 800,000 employees, which are going to be significantly influenced. And one of the key findings from that study that we've done is to note that the displacement factor of AI like ChatGPT will be offset by the creation of new tasks, right? Which we're all seeing. I just mentioned some of them, the way in which you have better editorial tasks, verifying how you work up the analysis from the outputs, how you check for content, hallucinations, and the like, in a very different rhythm of how you perform your work in the future.
Kellyann, do you see that kind of resistance from people within potential clients because they feel that their jobs or their tasks are at risk from something like Fincrime or from AI?
So I'd say that as a whole, there's a lot of cross-functional collaboration that's required to ensure that AI is as positive for the stakeholders as possible, let's say. So by regularly monitoring and assessing and updating AI solutions, that actually requires people to do so as well. I think there's always a risk whenever there is any new technology, but ultimately there's places to ensure the ethics continue to be appropriate, that's transparent, and all of this often comes back down to the human as well.
And Simone, in terms of that business adoption, I mean, you've worked with many businesses. Are businesses quick? Do you find that businesses are quick to adopt AI into their processes, or is there a fair bit of resistance?
So I've been working in AI since 2016. So I have a tech background, but was very much a generalist, and then decided 2016 AI was the thing for me. And I've worked in different roles across the ecosystem, but initially it was industries like advertising and marketing that were quick, especially online marketing and advertising, that were quick to adopt AI. The laggards traditionally were the highly regulated industries. I can't speak finance particularly, but particularly healthcare, right? So I think this whole idea of synthetic data and protecting PII, personally identifiable information, goes a long way. But sorry, to take a step back to your original question, initially what I saw was companies wanting to build it in-house themselves. So a lot of POCs that were failing, a lot of money that was being spent, a shoe manufacturer that wanted to be the next Tesla, right? Or the next Michelangelo platform, I think is what Uber uses, but not realizing that actually they were better off procuring a system than spending the resources building it from scratch, right? So initially, a lot of POCs, a lot of failures along the way. And the last few years, companies have really taken to, and the ecosystem has grown as well. Companies has really taken to procuring solutions from startups and scale-ups, and I guess now eventually unicorns. But industry specific, some industries were early adopters, right? Some industries I went into and they weren't even ready for the conversation, not necessarily primarily because they thought that AI was going to take their jobs. They were just unknowledgeable, right? They had so many failed POCs behind them, they didn't even want to have that conversation. On the point of how AI and how these large language models is going to reimagine the future of work, I am so excited to see this, right? So I've been watching the whole ChatGPT conversation online for the last 3 months. I haven't said anything, but to me, what dawned on me is that it's the future of work that's in the next 5 to 10 years that's really going to be affected, right? If we assume they get the ethics right and the transparency and the trust right, it's what someone who's graduating from university now, what is their role going to be like in 5 years, right? It's like we had Wikipedia. Now they have ChatGPT. What is that going to mean for roles and workflow?
Yeah,
I'm old enough to remember Ask Jeeves, so that was
Yes.
that really dates me.
Yeah.
But yeah, Michael, were you going to?
I was just going to say, I think a lot of great points Curlene has made there, and the timeframes. I think what we've been through is a period of, from an AI maturity perspective, becoming much more mature, and now had a great booster through things like ChatGPT. And so I liken it to the fact that we've been building over the last 5 years or more the foundations, whether it's through, as Curlene mentioned, the widening the ecosystem, the selection of great startups with ethically designed solutions. It's getting into place. If you think of a house analogy, it takes a long time to get the information governance ready for AI, and it looks like nothing's happening. But it is happening. And then, like the foundation of a house, once it's built, you can do the rest really quickly for those that are ready. So the idea of the AI maturity model is very helpful in terms of where are you? Are you aware of the conversations on AI? Are you piloting? Are you working with startups? Are you integrating it into your workflow? Are you sort of, quote unquote, getting to be more data driven as an organization? Very different stages. And we see parallels. If you go back, and I can also date to the sort of e-commerce of the 2000s, and everybody think, oh, there's nothing really going on. This little company, Amazon, and no one's following suit in retail. They'll be fine. And Debenhams going out of business a couple of years ago. In part, they weren't very digitally mature. There were other things there, but there's a similarity we're going to see, I think, with AI and AI readiness.
Yeah, and nothing can stop AI except maybe lawyers. So Michael, your student Manuel asked, when creating content, one question always arises: where are the copyrights for content that AI has created? And also, what about the all the content, the copyrighted content that AI scrapes to generate new content, right?
Yeah.
So, Michael, do you want to take
I can start with that. I'm sure others can. It's a great question, Manuel. Still an amazing student and professional. It is, I think, the number one of the big issues with, for example, ChatGPT is the extent to which copyright protections or IP rights will extend, right, to works which are used to train the algorithms and to develop the works created by the algorithm. How are they being accounted for? So big regulation issues coming up around protection of copyright and IP, which I think will could very, very much impact, how, whether there'll be stutters along the way of the rapid adoption of things like ChatGPT. But hugely important question, which I think we're just at the start. At the university, we like to coordinate across the law faculty, and they do a lot of great work on these sort of issues of data and IP rights. And increasingly, we're going to, in business, and need to really see how to work with regulators again closely on how these tools get used in the workflow, and to be very sensible about their, being aware of the importance of these issues of copyright and IP rights from being used in developing the works from these algorithms. Okay.
And I think this next question from Krista is something that Kellyann, probably Fincrime, does quite a bit of, right? Krista asks, how would you manage integration of AI with protection of personal data?
So here I don't want to talk too much about synthetic data, but again, unfortunately, the answer to this question is using synthetic data does take away that requirement, really. And so where it's being used in the medical world and very sensitive patient data, to where it's being used in the finance world and you have accounts and transactions, etc., using synthetic data really minimizes this risk completely. And I have had a question from someone before saying, well, why not just use real data? Well, that's the whole reason, is to not use real data. By using synthetic data, you take away these risks, and therefore it makes a lot of sense. Synthetic data can be used to generate examples, and that then can help explain how AI systems make decisions. And again, goes back to the transparency and accountability there.
Mm. And I think we could have time for one last question, which, since we're a business school, I think we should pay some time for this one. Someone on LinkedIn asked, as a mature parent to a 10-year-old who is so interested in YouTubers and online games and content, I'm curious to see what happens in the near future to traditional workplaces and whether the traditional school system will keep up. And I think we can start with Michael, as you're kind of on the front line of teaching.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you can imagine. I do get a lot of questions just talking to some leaders yesterday at BT, and the question came up similar to this from a schooling perspective or from a university perspective. What do you believe, or what's the university doing? What's the business school doing with respect to engaging and allowing for these tools in the learning process? And this is my personal opinion. It's very controversial in terms of there are many different views on this, but this is just here to stay with us, right? You've mentioned many times, Conrad, the amazing adoption rate of ChatGPT. Over 100 million in 2 months, and that's just going to spiral upwards. So it's going to be used. My view is that we need to see how it can be used appropriately, ethically, and efficiently, productively in the learning process, and in doing, for example, assignments, which will be what people will be doing in the real world anyway. So the issue then becomes ensuring accountability. So the extent to which then you require in your your assessments explicit provision of the use of the tool, say ChatGPT, in the framing and development of how it helps you in developing your work, your essay, your project, and provide that, and that might even get some marks, and then how you've built on that to provide your own creative development of the project. So it's got to be, I think, embraced, but integrated in a very sensitive, responsible way, but one where these are skills that are going to differentiate people in the workplace as well, if they are very effective in using them as a starting point for building knowledge.
Mm. Kellyann, you obviously recruit people to work in your company. Do you feel that people out there have the right skills when it comes to AI, so that they can work in this exciting new field?
I think it's always a process of continuous learning. I'm here because I'm an EMBA student at Cambridge back in 2018, and I think the working world is constantly changing, as is the AI world. And Michael's answer just then about education, we could also mention the metaverse here. So, how will that change the education system, where we're able to particularly jump from today's era, maybe back into the dinosaur times, and how would one live as a human then, versus jumping, let's say, 200 years forwards, and how would we be dealing with robots? And I think one of your previous podcasts was around the Starship robot moving around the place. And so I think maybe it's very exciting. It's exciting times. I know many of us can say a bad word about ChatGPT, but ultimately it has meant that the average person knows what AI can do. For some people, that has meant that they're scared about what ChatGPT can do, which is good as well, because as scared as you are about your personal data, then you should maybe think, okay, well, what protection am I taking? What have I read? Are there any, side items that I'm not aware of? Let me investigate a little bit more. Should I educate myself? Or should I go and do a real course? How does this affect my job today? Am I an accountant? Should I be an accountant with a little bit of AI experience, just in case? And so I think it's an exciting time. I'm excited to be involved in Fincrime Dynamics and using the vaccine analogy to say, let's try and fight financial crime, similar to how we fight viruses. But ultimately, for me, it's very much around education and not just sitting still and let something wave past you, but being proactive as much as possible.
Mm. And Curlene, you have the final word about this.
Yeah, I'm gonna keep it brief because we're at time. So I'm going back to the question, and she mentioned that her child was 10 years old. So I would say building in healthy habits, as Michael said, technology is here to stay, but just probing as a parent for their children, are you using the technology or is the technology using you, right? If they're if they're interested in gaming or using it for educational purposes, as much as there's mindless content on YouTube, where is the balance? I think from a teacher perspective, it's also setting the expectation to parents as to how tech should be used for homework, right? How it can be guided into their primary and secondary school lives. So by the time they get to university, there's more of a balance. And, just be conscious that sometimes we're using the technology, but sometimes the technology is also using us.
That's a great comment, which I will tell my 11-year-old daughter who just got her phone this week.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, Kellyann, and Curlene, for this incredibly engaging discussion about AI. I'm quite sure that in 1 month, the whole picture is going to change because the
Yeah.
field is just going so quickly. And I want to thank all of the viewers as well for all the comments, the questions. I'm sorry you couldn't get through all of them, but please join us for next week's episode, where we'll talk about how business school graduates are changing careers, what sectors are hot, what are not. So till then, stay safe, be well, and I will see you next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you.